I'll go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everyone to the first talk of the second season of Cal State San Bernardino's Disability Studies Lecture Series. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker today, I wanted to say some thank yous to our sponsors of the event today, which is supported by a grant from Accelerate InSoCal and the COG Neurodiversity space on our campus, which if you ever have a chance to check it out, is on the 4th floor of University Hall. It's an amazing space. I hope you can check it out. Many thanks to Thinh Ly for tech support today and to Pamela Crosson for administrative support. And gratitude to my fellow co-organizers of this series, Jeremy Murray, Jess Nerren, Tiffany Jones, and Jonathan Hall. So now it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Cyrée Jarelle Johnson. Johnson's first book of poetry, titled Slingshot, and from 2019, won the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Poetry. And his second book of poetry, Watch Night, which just came out earlier this year, you should get it, it's great, won the prestigious James Laughlin Award from the Academy of American Poets. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Yale Review, Granta, and Poetry Magazine, among many other venues. He earned an MFA from Columbia University, and he currently serves as the social media coordinator for Sins Invalid, a disability justice-based performance project that centers disabled people of color and LGBTQ artists. I read Johnson's Watch Night this weekend in preparation for today, and I have to say it is a book of devastating beauty, encompassing grief, longing, struggle, vulnerability, and displacement. Yet as you read it, and maybe it's just me, I don't know, but you will find the tears in your eyes are ultimately tears of joy, because it is ultimately and also a book about survival, about healing, and above all, about love. I have a feeling that we're going to get some more of that Cyrée Jarelle Johnson vibe in this talk today, which is titled Body, Mind, and Soul, the Spirit of Disability Justice. So thank you, Cyrée. I'll turn things over to you. We'll talk, Cyrée will talk for about 45 minutes, and there'll be a chance for a Q&A at the end. And the chat is open if you want to comment or ask questions. So thank you, Cyrée.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica, for inviting me. Just one quick correction. I recently got a promotion, so I'm no longer Sins Invalids social media and community engagement specialist. I am Sins Invalids communications director. So that's cool. Loving that. Happy to be here with you today. Oh, no apologies needed. Just wanted to announce that. I haven't announced it publicly at all, and I don't know that we've updated our site, so how would you know? All right, so my name is Cyrée Jarelle Johnson. I'm a poet and a card reader, and also, as I said before, I work at Sins Invalid. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about spirits, souls, the role of disablement in white supremacist patriarchy. And yeah, please do use the chat if you have questions, pushback, comments, concerns. I generally want to hear from you, not just talk at you, although it is a lecture, so I will be doing some talking at the screen. Hey, yeah, but if you have any questions along the way, I'd love to see them, would love to interact with you, would love to know what you know. I'm one of the lucky ones. I know it to be true because I grew up being told so. You're lucky I could have killed you. By my mother and by the news, I knew what happened to autistics whose needs were so unwieldy that no one could be blamed when, even as children, their short lives came to tragic ends. It's not a secret, the war on autistic children. Everyone sees it because it's broadcast to our screens and everyone is asked to justify it. To extend compassion to the parent, their struggles raising an autistic child, to the difficulty of finding help with childcare under capitalism, a real burden on our society, to the social ostracization and marginalization of parents of an autistic child face. The compassion goes everywhere freely and easily, everywhere but to the cooling corpse of the now dead autistic child. According to Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, 570 disabled people have been murdered by their caretakers in the last 5 years. We know that this is an undercount. This does not count people who ended their lives in suicide. It does not count people who died without receiving care or of medical neglect. It's not enough to remind the world that these now dead people had hopes, dreams, favorite colors, things they loved, things they hated, friends, enemies. We must ask what abled society actually sees in disabled people that renders us disposable, what that disposability steals from our collective spirit, and how it's connected to systems that poison us all. Disabled people like myself, the lucky ones, who survive childhood into adulthood, rarely do so without facing additional disablement. That could be CPTSD from being forced to stay in a home that hates you or a school that bullies you, with a lover who is intent on harming you when they cannot kill you. It could be additional disabilities due to the trauma and stress of disabled lives. Be that as it may, many groups and populations of disabled people are encouraged to think of themselves as non-disabled people. Growing up as a Black person in a small working class community, the definition of disability was when someone has to start taking care of you full time. Anything other than that was a difference. You just had some problems or a body part that's not working right no more. This makes sense because absolutely everyone around me was disabled. There were no exceptions. After I was suspended for self-injurious behavior in high school, an aunt took me for a car ride and asked me if I thought I was special. Then she revealed her own suicide attempts. When I developed a pronounced limp at 14, which was the first sign of lupus, my grandmother, who lived with severe OCD and physical debility, implored me to simply stop walking around. If they think you're crippled, you'll be a target. It was decent advice, and she was right. When I entered college at 18 with the same limp, my best friend called me a gimp and accused me of faking. We're both disabled now. We're all disabled now. When my mother survived 7 strokes at 47 years old and became permanently disabled, lost her job at the Target, and enrolled in SSDI, my grandmother and I sat her down in the local Perkins, as you do when you're from Central New Jersey, and encouraged her to learn sign language because of her aphasia. She told us that she didn't want to be thought of as disabled. We were shocked. We asked why. Because I'm vain, she told us. When we said we are both disabled, she repeated, I'm vain. For Black people, these lines, these definitions are drawn from anti-Blackness. What could non-disablement mean under enslavement? What could it have meant under the lynching regime of Jim Crow or after the Tulsa Massacre or for the men in the Tuskegee syphilis study? For the women of Puerto Rico who were test subjects to oral birth control? For those who received Mississippi appendectomies, women like my great-grandmother who simply woke up without uteruses? For Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, enslaved women upon whose backs modern gynecology was founded? For the enslaved children mining cobalt for Apple, Google, Dell, Microsoft, Tesla, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo right now? Nothing. It means nothing. In the shitty 400 some odd years we've been here, rarely has there ever been a chance for a Black person to live a life unexpected by disability, and it changes our definition of what disability is. Many diseases that marginalized people face are not confined to a single part of our body, which means the traditional models of debility and disability, even those advanced within disability justice, can't hold what's going on. On the day-to-day, I can't ensure any part of my body will not be a cause of concern. In the last year alone, I've had days where I was unable to walk, days where I wasn't able to talk, days where my fingers and wrists were unavailable to me, where my skin was covered in rashes, where parts of my body were turgid and in flames, and yes, days where all of those things were true at once, and days in which none of them were true. These are considered mild to moderate manifestations of lupus. At worst, people with lupus may appear no different from any other wheelchair user, any other dialysis patient, any other disabled person. Trauma is, to let Merriam-Webster tell it, the Greek word for wound. Anti-Blackness is inherently traumatic on a personal, interpersonal, national, and global level. In 2017, a study undertaken by a psychiatric Genomics Consortium in Boston found that PTSD is heritable. The link is strongest from mother to daughter. Researchers found that for a white woman, genetics were 29% of her risk for getting PTSD, barring other factors. CPTSD and PTSD increase your likelihood of developing autoimmune diseases. Another 2017 study in Nature Reviews Rheumatology states that a longitudinal study of 54,763 women followed over 24 years, investigators found that the incidence of systemic lupus erythematosus was highest in women with probable post-traumatic stress disorder than women not exposed to trauma. They also found a strong association between trauma exposure, regardless of PTSD symptoms, and incidence of systemic lupus erythematosus. Disablement is a function of ableism that aims to create a disposable class of disabled people. Disablement is essential to racial capitalism because disabled people are considered people too broken to fight back. Those in power see us as weak and dependent, waiting to be controlled. For the last year, we've streamed what mass disablement looks like on our phones, for genocide always has such a component. And the genocide in Palestine is a textbook example of this. Palestinians are subject to mass disablement because the engineers of Israel's campaign of genocide believe a disabled population will not have the means or will to defend their lives. This is not only apparent in the fact that at least 10 children in Gaza every day have their legs amputated, but in the long-term effects of starvation and childhood disease. Nor is this only apparent in Gaza, but throughout the African continent, where forced malnutrition and starvation has left children who grow into adults with inflammation throughout their guts that make them subject to still more disease. In American disability communities, there is often a focus on inborn disabilities. We say that disability is natural and beautiful, which is true. Yet that is not the whole story of disability. Disability is natural and it is manufactured. It's beautiful and horrific. It's mundane and it's spiritual. In what we're currently going through, Hurricane Helene, disabled people were systemically non-evacuated, being left to die. In Hurricane Katrina, at Memorial Medical Center, where at least four disabled people were murdered rather than transported to safer ground. We see this disposability both in disabled subjects and those who are most subject to disablement, groups of people who will also not be evacuated, including incarcerated people. In the context of the American campaign of ableist terror at home, the focus on inborn disabilities makes perfect sense. The vulnerability of babies and young children is no secret. Without the reminder that disability and debility occurs in all life forms, from flowers to elephants to humans, disability can morph into and be marketed as something wholly preventable. If we simply stick longer needles into the amniotic fluid or stop certain people from reproducing with others. Yet the laser focus on inborn disability belies the fact that many, if not most, disabled people acquire their disabilities once they're out of the womb. It ignores and cannot account for how certain populations, even within the United States, are systemically targeted for disablement and punished for their disabilities. I am, of course, the progeny of American chattel enslavement, a force of mass disablement that designed the country as we know it as a whole. My ancestors represent what was once the most reliable monetary standard in the United States, one that existed before the first coin was minted. Paper money was introduced to the United States in 1690. My mother's original ancestors on these shores was kidnapped from the Kingdom of Congo in the mid to late 1600s, trafficked through the ports of Virginia, some of the earliest in this country, and enslaved by the Dutch and English colonizers of New York and New Jersey. It is no hyperbole in saying that there was no such thing as an abled slave. And yet the traffic in humans was predicated on finding able-bodied Africans to break. And that is a term that slavers used into enslaved subjects. This breaking itself is a form of disablement. When it didn't break the body, it was designed to crush the spirit. Disablement under enslavement was designed to crush Black humanity into something whiteness could profit from. This is what we see in the hurricanes to come. This is what we see in the climate crisis. This is what we see during COVID-19, when particulate matter was a deciding factor as to whether or not COVID in New York City would be severe, as it was often in the Bronx and in some parts of Queens, or if its most severe manifestations would be elided. The accumulation of harsh industrial matter in the lungs changes the way the body processes diseases and changes the amount of inflammation in the body. Different communities are subject to it at different rates. This too, the breaking of the body and the breaking of the spirit, was the use of the disablement of lynching to enrich white people and to kill Black people and leave the rest of the Black population traumatized. When Nat Turner was lynched, he was boiled down into a substance slavers believed medicinal and eaten as a health tonic. So too were mummies eaten. This left those in his immediate region in Virginia unable to ingest certain medicines without compounding trauma for fear they were being forced to eat Nat Turner himself. What does the centuries-long campaign of racial terror against Black people in the United States teach us about disability? Not only that disablement is a profitable endeavor, but that once it is created, it works on its own. That it creates and recreates disabled subjects, and that when they become too disabled, they are subject to disproportionate death, disproportionate disease, and punishment for the disease itself. Lupus, again, is a disease that I have lived with since puberty, and one that disproportionately affects Black people. And it's an excellent example of how disablement of the Black body is a diasporic endeavor of the spirit-breaking forces of trauma and the body-breaking forces of inflammation and autoimmunity. George Floyd, an asthmatic, is an excellent example of this as well. Asthma is a chronic lung disease where the lungs become inflamed in response to triggers in the body and in the environment. Asthma is 44% more likely to occur in Black people than white people. In Black people, disability is seen once as weakness and inevitability. Floyd was determined by autopsy not to have been murdered by the police who shut his windpipe with the full force of their body weight, by his own disabled body. When a disabled person is murdered by the police, the problem as society sees it is disability. When a disabled person is murdered by a parent, the problem as society sees it is disability. When a disabled person dies of medical neglect, climate crisis, genocide, war, or famine, the problem as society sees it is disability. As I mentioned earlier, through a series of genetic tests and exacting historic research, I've combined with the serendipity of being part of a relatively small population of descendants of the enslaved in New Jersey and New York, I've been able to trace my lineage back to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. As someone who works in a religion with roots in Congo traditions, this was edifying and clarifying. It is with this range of vantage points by which I call your sustained attention to the ongoing genocide in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 400,000 women are raped each year to support the likes of Elon Musk and Bill Gates. It is itself a result and expansion of the ongoing colonization of the African continent. The goal of rape is to break someone, to crush their spirit, to literally render them unable to fight back and enjoy the results of that. To quote feminist Susan Brown Miller, rape is about power, not sex. The goal of white supremacy is power through all means to break the spirit of non-white people and to create a hierarchical binary by which power can be naturalized and justified. Patriarchal white supremacy and its endless quest for categorization and hierarchy is without fail the primary force of disablement on the planet. Ableism is secondary to this impulse, not primary. It is the sorting that happens after the disablement occurs. Disablement functions too by deciding which bodies are disabled through the mechanisms of the state. Diseases experienced disproportionately by Black people are often not eligible for government assistance, a problem that so pervaded SSI cases for people with lupus, the rules had to recently be changed. Thus, someone like George Floyd would likely have experienced disablement in the environment where he grew up, and equally likely to have been considered non-disabled by the state that killed him, then blamed his death on the disability they would have ignored and failed to support. By deciding who is disabled, the state decides who deserves care and how urgently. It means that sick and disabled Black people have no option but to work themselves onto early death. And knowing this inevitability of dishumanization is also intended to crush the spirit. It's intended to push people into all manners of disabling self-soothing, whether addiction, violence, or the suppression of feelings. Disablement is bigger than the process of identifying as disabled politically or personally, which is often the goal of the disability movement as a whole, for people to identify personally as disabled. But what would we gain by identifying disablement as it occurred? What will we learn by identifying things like rape, racism, ableism, transphobia as primary targets of disablement rather than focusing on the end product of disability? The goal of disablement is to target and eliminate groups of people deemed dangerous, less than useful, weak, or undesirable, which too is the foundation of capitalism. Disablement is an organizing political project of capitalism and white supremacy. The sole goal of disablement is to create a class that can be worked hard for little money until they become unprofitable or unruly, at which point they are killed or left to die. We see that in sheltered workshops. We see that at the Judge Rotenberg Center. We see it how we educate children. This has been an ongoing lesson as well during COVID. As someone with lupus, when COVID started, I knew that it was really going to be bad because immediately my medication, hydroxychloroquine, was taken away with no notice. I got an email from my insurance company that my hydroxychloroquine was better used on non-disabled subjects. This was a pattern of ongoing disablement that was almost taken for granted. We got a letter and it said that hydroxychloroquine would stay in our body for up to 40 days. There was an extreme shortage. People were stockpiling it. And why? Because Donald Trump said it on the news. That was all it took to take me off of medication that I had been on for almost a decade. Right? It took months for me to reestablish a regular hydroxychloroquine regimen. And more than that, even today, doctors ask me before, or pharmacists, I guess, ask me what I take hydroxychloroquine for, making sure I'm not using it to prevent COVID, despite having been on it well before, a decade before COVID ever started. Many immunocompromised people as well, who took other kinds of medications, had our medicine removed to us, our deaths justified, and have been unable to justify or access qualified medical care for nearly 5 years. Between COVID, climate crisis, and ongoing genocide throughout the world, capitalism is killing us, and disabled people have a spiritual duty to fight for our lives. If we understand that the role of disablement is to crush us, to render us unable to fight back, then tending to our spirits is the way that we keep ourselves and each other alive. If the assumption is that we are unable to join together because of our disabilities, then let us take our examples from disabled people around the world and prove them wrong, for it is a testament to our own spiritedness. This is in large part why ableism often has a spiritual component. The idea that disabled people are either being cursed or punished by God, have something on them like a curse, that they are themselves a curse into families. When that sort of dehumanizing rhetoric becomes spiritual, it means that not only are disabled people often discriminated against in spiritual spaces, but thought of as undesirable for spiritual work, right? As early as I can remember, I was told this story, growing up evangelical Christian in the AME church. I was told this story about Jesus, where essentially some guys had a disabled friend, and Jesus essentially takes this guy out of his house by a rope and changes him from sick to well. And I was encouraged to think of my body in this way, to think of my body as something I was going to eventually be liberated from by death, that death was the best possible scenario. In fact, Not so long ago, I had a friend tell me that she thought that I was always going to be the friend who died, and that she had expected me to die before now. I have been diagnosed since I was 20, so this is my 15th year living with lupus. And thinking about that and the role it has in shaping one's will to live, right? Which is also a kind of spiritedness, one's will to continue on. And so also thinking about growing up as an autistic person called an indigo child. I've been reading cards since I was 13, interpreting dreams since I was 13, working in Hindu tradition. And thinking about how what marked me for comments from my mother, such as, you're lucky, I could have killed you, also set me apart in my community as someone who was thought of as gifted, and protected me from an evangelical church that thought very poorly about those sorts of activities and gifts, because they believed my autism to simultaneously be something that was a unique curse on them, but something that made me closer to God, and the other side, and so justified those things. How can it be both at once, right? How can there exist, without a spiritual element, this simultaneous fear and repulsion of disabled people, and also an idea that we know something special? And in addition to that, how can we make the political fight for our lives something that has a spiritual aspect? Lately, I have been looking towards the work of the Society of Disabled Oracles, started by Alice Wong, Amy Hamre, and Jen White Johnson, which they describe as a living chorus and archive of disabled wisdom from the past, present, and future. It highlights disabled heroes and also disabled archetypes, one of them being Harriet Tubman, of course, and also their own living selves, to think about the role of disabled people as being able to predict the future. When I think about other disabled people who are able to predict the future right now with my students, I am reading A Few Rules to Predicting the Future by Octavia Butler. And Octavia Butler is, widely thought of as somebody who was able to predict the future with her work, right? To which she often responded that she was a good student of history and observant. And I think that that is profound, because the reason that disabled people are often credited with the ability to predict the future is because we are often living it. So if there is a fear of climate crisis, disabled people are already living in that crisis, as we see from continued hurricanes, fire season, et cetera, and who will be saved and who won't be saved, right? If we're worried about economic collapse, we see that disabled people are already living, by and large, without jobs, without the means to be employed, in situations where we cannot marry each other because our ability to receive money to stay alive will be cut. If we fear that we're living in a future of confinement, we need only to look at systems of nursing homes, psych wards. Oh, someone put something in the chat for information about Octavia Butler. See octaviabutler.com. Yeah, do. I would also say, read Octavia Butler's books. They're very important books. Yes, we need only to look for towards congregate environments that are overwhelmingly full of disabled people to know that disabled people are canaries in the coal mine of capitalism itself. While it's likely that we can't reverse the functions of disablement and ableism or their crushing presence in our lives, we can do the work that keeps us alive. I've also recently been thinking a lot about Crip eSIMs for Gaza, stewarded by Jane Shi, Leah Lakshmi Singha, and Alice Wong, looking towards Clean Air Club, and of course, to Sins Invalid's work on climate crisis and climate grief, and thinking about how those projects are a testament to disabled future telling and disabled spiritedness, right? They catalyze what it means for us to fight back, to not stop, and also to believe in a disabled future, a future where disability will proliferate, but where disabled people are still alive. Sins Invalid also has a show in December, and I guess you are all in California, or most of you are in California, so I do personally invite you to the Sins Invalid show. Stages of Grief, Crip Hearts on Fire. It's important to me to remember that. Yes. If we are living in the future, then it is our responsibility to keep fighting, singing, shouting, and saving one another. Thank you. I like the little hands. Thank you for the clapping hands.
Thank you so much, Cyrée, for that very clear and just and very devastating picture, and for that hope and joy at the end. And the same vibe happens in your poetry as well. And yeah, so we have put a lot of time here for comments or questions from the audience. You can put it in the chat, or you could put a question in the Q&A, whichever you prefer.
I could kick us off with a question.
Yes.
Okay, so first, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. Clearly, you're such a scholar of history and the interwoven nature of all the different things that affect present day reality, whatever that present day reality may be for anyone, and in any identity group, right? And especially Black and disabled. And I really appreciate that. I mean, I think about it a lot. Like, I'm sitting at Berkeley down the street from the deaf and blind school that was shut down for non-disabled students to be able to be housed. And I think that these examples, to me, like, I feel like they're really important. I happened to have the pleasure of spending a weekend with Temple Grandin 2 weeks ago, right? And so I was kind of guiding her around and taking her through this thing, and we would talk, and I would mention stuff like that to her, and she would say things like, sometimes you just have to live in the present, right? And only the way that Temple Grandin does. And I was like, I might fundamentally disagree with that, because I don't think I know what the present is if I don't know what the past is that led up to it, and to each their own, and that's fine. But it's something that I'm just kind of beginning to mull through, right? Because definitely, like, as I think about, my son's realities, as an autistic college student, like, the past does play a role in what I see him experience every day. And his drives to try to pass when it's unsafe for him come from somewhere. And so I was just wondering, like, do you, as I'm mulling this over and going, well, these histories are really important. Like, the history you just shared with us is really important, right? And like, so much of critical scholarship, like, troubles the notion of a singular identity. It troubles the notion of a dominant narrative. So do you have any advice for me as I kind of mull over this way that I happen to reflect on things, and then some of the jarring advice that I've gotten, like, from other autistic scholars along the way? How do you make sense of that, or how do you navigate it, when you get, feedback such as, is it just be in the present? It's like, no, but we got here somehow, and you got here somehow, and you dove deep in that with so much meaning and importance. So what advice do you have?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that the past, present, and future are always living together. Like, I don't know that I believe in that time works like there is a past and there is a future, and here I am in the present. Like, I don't know that that's my personal theory of time. I don't know that, like, that time makes a lot of sense. I think that, like, thinking of things in their neat little lines, it sometimes, for instance, like, makes us feel really far from Jim Crow when it was, it was not that long ago. Like, my mother died, like, was born like very shortly after the fall of Jim Crow. My grandfather was part of the Great Migration, right? So it wasn't that long ago. It's like not even as old enough for that. Like, its youngest living survivors aren't even old yet. Like, it is that present, right? So, like, I think that there is one model of the past that says as soon as something ends, it's in the past, right? And I think that that's the kind of past that those of us who like myself, were young when Obama was running the first time, like we're sort of sold, right? Like where it's like change, progress, the future, right? We are stepping into this future and everything behind us. Right. I was 1 year old when that came out. I was alive when I'm older than the ADA and I'm not an old person. I'm 35. So really thinking about how there's this rush and even thinking about the ADA, right? Like the ADA is great and important, right? Like I'm certainly not going to shit on the ADA because you can't have justice without rights. And at the same time, the ADA is something that you have to sue people in order to enforce, right? Like if you do not have money, what does the ADA mean to me? Like unless I can like meaningfully enforce it, what's it going to do for me? Like just not even on a, like it shouldn't exist or it doesn't matter. It does matter and should exist. And it doesn't go very far at all, right? It's designed for rich disabled people who probably would have sued anyway. And it's also an important step, right? We do want standards. But when's the last time you went to a coffee shop and there was like a low enough counter for a disabled person to get coffee, right? So like it makes a difference in the cases where someone can get sued and like not in their everyday life, right? So are we really past, like, is the ADA really in the past, or are we like working to build what the ADA says it wanted under, Bush, like in the present, right? Or is that like, are we in the long moment of the ADA, right? So when does that moment begin and end? I think that concepts of times are also cultural, right? So if you live in Spain and you're going to have a siesta in the middle of the day, your concept of time, and you expect people when you say 5 to show up at 8, that's a much different concept of time than like puritanical American time, where if I say you need to be there at 5, you better be there at 4:55, right? Those are 2 different ways of living time. So I think that like first, Temple Grandin, autism, like I think that's good. Like I think that it's good we had a Temple Grandin, like no shade to Temple Grandin, but like, she made a bunch of advances in slaughterhouses. That's what Temple Grandin did, like in addition to many other things, but like that too, right? Like it's like efficient killing machines. So her concept of time may be different than a poet's concept of time. I think that that's fair and fine, right? Because it isn't just cultural, right? It's personal. People have personal ideas of time, like the friend who's always late. That being said, in terms of history, nothing in America is old. Like America is not an old country. It's a very young country. And even though I'm not somebody who's very well traveled, but I am someone who has a children's book on Greek immigration to the United States, right? So like thinking about something like Greece, like how old is America? America is a very young idea. There's nothing in America that can be said to be long in the past, right? American colonization is continuing today. So none of it is past. And I think that it's one of those times where unfortunately poets are correct and like multiple things have to be true at once, right? That things are getting better and like some things are improving and that like things are also staying the same. That like there's no way to get a clean cut on us being in the disabled future in the same way that like the disabled past continues on. I even think about things like, for instance, right, like talking about Anarcha, Bessie, and Lucy, 3 women who, were carved apart to advance modern gynecology, right? But like thinking about now, right, thinking about like the incredibly high rates of Black people dying in childbirth, thinking about the incredibly, or even something like the fact that nobody will let you be medicated to get a colposcopy, right? That you can't even get like a numbing agent when someone uses scissors to cut your uterus. Like all of that is the long afterlife of the procedures they did on those women, right? So like, how can you say that this kind of experimentation is in the past when I can think about, even my great grandmother, like I said, she woke up without a uterus. It was very common. And she raised me, right? It's not like I didn't know my great grandmother. I knew her very well. I grew up sharing a bed with her. Thinking about even things that happened to my mother, things that happened, like thinking about having lovers with endometriosis, right? And how they're just allowed to suffer and, told that there's nothing going on. Like all of that is long afterlife. So how can we say, well, this is neatly in the past when it's still happening, right? Which is a complex answer to a complex question. But I do think that folks who think of time as like super material are people who think of time differently than I do. Okay, Daniel Rubens asks, is there a system besides capitalism that you believe will be viable for a sustainable future? Not forever, right? Like, I think that like ultimately capitalism is about the worst that I can think of. There's a reason that the 10 principles of disability justice are predicated on anti-capitalism, right? Because disablement is inherent to capitalism, right? Even the idea that we're supposed to work for 8 to 12 hours a day, first of all, is an improvement upon what existed before that, to which we have anarchists to thank. The idea of a weekend, again, an improvement, for which we have anarchists to thank, and socialists. So maybe socialism. I think socialism is good. I am a socialist. But capitalism is not sustainable for the planet, right? It's not just going to create disablement in ourselves. It's going to disable the earth. And that is also what disables us, right? When the planet cannot sustain clean water, we become disabled. When the planet cannot sustain clean air, we become disabled. There's nothing else we can do because we depend on those systems in order to be healthy. Without healthy water, we cannot be healthy. Without healthy air, we cannot be healthy. Without healthy soil, we can't be healthy. We just can't. It's not possible. And there are some of us who are more insulated than others, but like, that's not a forever thing, right? In the same way that I said, in many ways, disabled people are living in the future, right? Like where you can't get to clean air, you can't get to clean water. Yeah, like that is the future that capitalism promises us. So thinking about specifically like a very green kind of socialism, yes, I do think that is a more sustainable idea for us. And also thinking about like, even just something like universal healthcare, right? Which I guess is like a socialized idea. And I know most of you are in California, right? I remember being in California. That was great. Just having insurance, paying very few copays, right? Like if you're living in California, like you can't imagine what it's like to, I pay $800 a month for insurance. I pay $800 a month for insurance. Like nobody can tell me that's equitable. That doesn't make sense. And I pay taxes. Like I pay significant taxes and I still pay that, right? So thinking about like, what is the most just system? I don't know that we're there yet, right? I don't know that we're going to find utopia next. But I think that we could admit that having people who are trillionaires is probably not a good use of the Earth's resources, and that some of that money, if not all of it, needs to be redistributed so that, I don't know, almost all the world does not have to live in abject malnourishment, poverty, genocide, and war. I think that for me is really a good next step. Do I know that it's going to sustain us forever and be beautiful and perfect as soon as capitalism falls? I actually know it isn't. I know it's not. I know that the transition from capitalism to anything else is going to fucking suck. It's going to be bad. But like also it's going to be bad for more people instead of just concentrating all of the badness somewhere where it doesn't impact those who capitalism is meant to protect, right? And so that is the fear. Like I know that it's like not going to be like, oh yeah, so fun. Like we're moving the grid to green grid. That's a great day for me. And I didn't have electricity for a long time or whatever, you know, like that's going to be a bad time, right? And also like there are people who are living that right now. Like anything you like think about like the transition from capitalism, remember that people are being forced by capitalism to live like that right now, right? That like the third world is as such, the global south is as such because we live like we do, right? So like if there's a fear of living that way, not saying that that's what this person is saying at all, but like for any of us, if there's a fear of living that way, it's like, why would you inflict that and export that around the world if that's your personal fear instead of fixing that? And then you just have to fear everyone, right? Like that's America's whole thing, is that like it makes the world very shitty and then fears everyone and goes to war with them so they can't write it. Like that's all we do, which we know is unsustainable, right? Every bomb we drop makes our air less clean, makes us sicker. The air is everywhere. The water is everywhere, right? So I think that, yeah, like, is there like something that's going to be viable forever? Probably not. Probably not. But do I think socialism is better? Yes. Yes, I do.
Can I ask a
Please,
question?
yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I really love this idea that what you were describing here about the idea of disablement. And so thinking about, you know, the ways that disabled people are like there's things that's happening to them, right? They're being targeted, and you know, this idea of elimination and breaking and that kind of thing. It's, you know, instead of just thinking about disability, which seems like something that is owned by the body of the person with the disability. And I wonder if you could talk about the kind of, one of the things that it came up in both the things I said about your work is this way that you're able to kind of toggle between and imbricate these ideas of both the idea of disablement as something that is terrible that's being done to people, but also at the same time thinking of disability as, you know, what you were saying about tending to our spirits and how we survive. And, you know, so disability as a kind of identity and disabled joy, and, you know, like, so I find I'm really interested to hear your kind of wisdom about kind of balancing those two messages that are both very real, but sometimes seem to be in contradiction with one another almost.
Totally. I mean, disability is the largest minority, so people's feelings about their disability really vary. You know, like as someone with lupus, this is a disease of trauma, you know? So like, it's like, do I feel like great about having lupus? Like, no, I don't. I don't feel awesome about having lupus. Do I feel great about being autistic? Yes, I do. Every day I wake up and I'm like, haha, good for me. But like, do I think every autistic person like has to feel that way? I was also diagnosed in childhood, right? So like, that's also different too. Like when I look at folks who were diagnosed as adults, like we're having really different experiences. So like surviving, not that it's better or worse, right? It's not. But like surviving an autistic childhood, like I'm just weird and different, off-putting a little. Like that's just what I am, right? I've had a lot of time to get used to the way that people don't like autistics. So I want to say that first, right? Like I don't like disabled people, even more than most other groups for whom this is true, are not a monolith. Like I think about like how certain groups of disabled people can be extremely conservative about things that other disabled people are really liberal about because they're the ones who are disproportionately targeted for extermination. I don't agree with them, right? But like I can think of like several communities of disability that like have some pretty conservative views, like as a, you know, like sometimes as a group, just because they are the ones who are targeted for a particular kind of marginalization, right? Or like for whom like are really shouldering the burden of like neurodivergent genocide. Like I think about like, I think about the Judge Rottenberg Center every day. I think about it every day. Like the idea that like children, Black mostly, brown mostly, children can be shocked and tortured by the UN definition of torture. But because they are autistic children, this is fine. That children are being strapped to a board and electrocuted. That's fine because they are autistic and they are not acting in ways that allistic people believe they should, right? So we're all having very different experiences. Like I have to think about like early disability stuff. Yeah, I don't know that I agree that human beings are inherently violent. I don't know if I agree with that. I think our societies are violent. I think that when we come together, violence gets normalized. I think when we say human beings are inherently violent, we normalize it further. Yeah, I think that human beings are more likely to do as a group does. I think that we're pack animals. So like when one is engaging in violence, we can be driven to violence, but we also know that human beings did not get this far by violence. Like we ultimately have gotten here through sharing, taking care of each other's young, right? Like by like adopting each other as families when we have none, of taking good care of each other. So even if human beings are, I don't know about naturally evil, that feels very Christian to me. And I'm not a Christian, so I can't really talk about like our natural roots of evil because it's just not something I believe. Yeah, like I don't co-sign that. But I know people feel differently. What I will say is that let's like entertain it and say that people are inherently violent. For every violent impulse, you can find somebody who is being nonviolent, right? So are we inherently violent, or are people being violent, right? Or do people enact violence, right? Are our societies violent? Do our societies, especially with the scarcity of capitalism, do they drive us to violence? Do they drive us outside of what our natural tendencies are? How can we even ascertain what our natural tendencies are when we are under a system that is so coercive, right? Like if you are starving, maybe you are going to be violent. If you see somebody else with a home and you have no home, you may be violent towards that person, right? Like that might be your tendency, but is it inherent? Or is it manufactured by the scarcity in our society? We can't know because we live in a society that manufactures scarcity and normalizes that scarcity. People were surviving on Earth before capitalism existed. There is something before capitalism, and people were living under it. They were enjoying food. They were doing all kinds of stuff, right? And we can't totally know what they did because academia itself, as we know it, sorry to you, and to myself too, because obviously, I mean, I have an MFA, I have an MSLIS, I'm a librarian. So academia, yeah, I know her. You know, but ultimately academia as we know it is shaped in the shape of colonialism. It's like meant to colonize thought. So whatever we think is inherent is also shaped by who taught us that, right? So I don't know. I think we should try it and see. Maybe we should try getting rid of capitalism and see if we're all still very violent. Maybe we should maybe we should meet everybody's base needs and see how violent people remain. And then I'll have a more hardline stance on it, I think. Anyways, okay, so there's three parts of what I'm going to say. And so there's disability, right? The basic fact of disability, right? Like I have blank, I am blank, whatever, right? Then there is debility, right? So like the fact of impairment, which could be separate wholly from disability, right? I don't know that on a day-to-day basis I feel impaired at this point in my life because I've been able to structure my entire life around having autism. I don't know that I'm feeling impaired by autism, right? Lupus now, yes. I'm feeling right now in my ankle, in my body, I'm feeling the debility of lupus. And then there's disablement, right? So disablement causes debility. It may cause disablement. And so those are three separate forces to me that are around disability, but separate from disability. So when I think about disablement, right? So let's use like racial capitalism as an example, right? So like the debility of growing up working class, not having any medical care growing up, not having insurance, having violent parents, right? All of these things, right? That's a debility. But the disability, me living with a disability is the testament that I survived that, right? So I can be proud of my disability while simultaneously not thinking that the creation of more disability violently is a good idea, right? Because disabled people are never going anywhere. There's never been a time before us. There will never be a time after us, right? But like the campaign of disablement is to create a group of subjects that aren't just disabled, but disposably so, right? We don't think of Elon Musk as a disposable autistic. We do think of the children in Judge Roddenberry Center as disposable, right? Like that is completely different, but we know they're both autistic, right? So what is the difference, right? And so like that kind of subject, in the same way that like the idea that we're inherently violent, it is manufactured, right? Like whatever we may think about its truth or fiction, it does benefit someone, right? It's not like a neutral observation of the world. Or even thinking about like someone like, I think about like all of these conversations about Donald Trump and his diaper, right? So like, oh, Donald Trump shat in a diaper on stage, right? That is the way that society approaches disability, right? Like where it's something humiliating, embarrassing, like something that is terrible, like it's just something to be avoided. And so his supporters, in order to continue to support him, have to be like, the diaper, it's justice, right? Where they don't feel that way about any other disabled, like, most other groups of disabled people, right? They don't feel like disablement should end or ableism should end, right? They think that that one specific disabled person should not be subject to that ableism, right? And so I think about like disablement as being the campaign to create the kind of disabled subject that can be disposed of, can be easily killed. Jasper Pawar goes into this in her book, The Right to Maim. It is the function of police violence. It's the provenance of segregation, right? Apartheid. It is meant to disable you so you die faster, so you can easily be killed. So you can be killed in a hands-off way, right? In the same way that starvation, famine, these kinds of things. Even if it doesn't kill you in the moment, it will kill you. And so that is like, disability can be celebrated even with the even sometimes, especially with the understanding that it is being manufactured and created. Yeah, slow violence, slow death, absolutely. But like disability and the celebration of disability is a testament to our survival. Disablement is an acknowledgement that someone didn't want us to survive. Can I touch more on educational practices and policy and disability? Can I? Not really. I don't I do teach. I teach tarot. I spend most of my days, I actually just came from my class. I was like, I'm going to be giving, and it intersected as always. But yeah, in terms of like educational philosophy, like, no, I really can't. I guess like at one point when I was like actively working as an academic librarian, like maybe I could, But nah, I don't think I can. Sorry about that. In terms of policy, disability policy, not really. Nothing comes to the mind unless you have something specific in question. But I can't just like pull it from there. Educational practices, policy, just no, I really can't. Sorry about that. Let's see. Mexico has an electric car. Yeah, accessibility, like accessibility policies. One thing I'll say is access suggestions for public events and for like organizing and protest. That's like one of the things that that Citizens Valid has written extensively about. So I would recommend if somebody wouldn't mind pulling that up from the website, like and putting in the chat, that would be amazing. Mexico has an electric car that's interestingly enough made with ethically sourced lithium. That doesn't. Thank you for coming, Kirk. Have a good one. Being made with ethically sourced lithium that does not come from Congo. What are your thoughts? I don't know that I believe it. Is also half the price. Competing brands like Tesla than Tesla. Well, it's easy to be half the price of a Tesla. I asked this since you previously mentioned the ongoing genocide and exploitation happening in Congo, and I'd love to hear your perspective. I think that I love the idea of ethically sourced lithium. I'll say that first. I will say that for a long time, the mines in Congo, like Elon Musk and the like, and major captains of industry in the United States, swore up and down that their cobalt specifically was not coming from artisanal mines, which is mines that people mine by hand. That they were coming from mines where people were mining with regular tools and not having to dig in the mud, but and like injure themselves, hurt themselves, and be again disabled or become disabled through this process. And that has been shown to be overwhelmingly not the case. So I'm like, well, huge if true, right? Huge if true. I hope that's true. I want that to be true. But like also the ongoing genocide in Congo is a very long one, and comes from the history of colonization in that region, specifically, by like the French, the United States, things like that. And is a continuation of colonialism and the disablement of colonialism, right? So like merely finding a different way to access that source material is not necessarily like, hopefully it'll be an improvement. If people in Congo say it's an improvement, I believe it, right? If like industry is like, it's an improvement, I promise, I'm like, I don't know. So I think that the goal to me, like if we want to lessen disablement, we will have to lessen colonialism. Like we will have to eliminate colonialism to eliminate or that kind of disablement. There will be other kinds of disablement, right? But the manifestations of colonialism, we see them around the world, right? Anti-Blackness is a manifestation of colonialism because enslavement is a manifestation of colonialism. As is the pillaging and genociding of Africa. Like those are manifestations of colonialism. So colonialism ending would be a boon to the end of disablement. But disablement will continue in other forms, right? It's not like it would be like, hooray, that's the end of it. But I know that I am at time. So that's all I'll say about that.
All right. Thank you so much, Cyrée, for a fantastic talk and Q&A session. We appreciate you so much. And I hope everyone goes out and buys your book, Watch Night and the Slingshot. And we appreciate you so much. And thanks everyone for coming. And we have another event coming up next spring. So keep your eyes on your emails for more events from the Disability Studies Lecture Series. So thanks everyone.
Thank you.